My name is Delia, and I am 29 years old. I am an estate lawyer in Toronto, which means I spend my days reading the documents most people never want to think about: wills, powers of attorney, trust agreements, the quiet paperwork that decides what happens to everything a person built. My family always found that faintly amusing, not impressive. Amusing. My brother liked to say I spent my career helping rich people fight over their china cabinet. My father would laugh along with him. Neither of them understood that the reason people need estate lawyers is because families like ours exist. I know that now. I wish I had understood it sooner. What I am about to tell you starts on the Friday of the Thanksgiving long weekend in October. It ends with my father and my brother being walked off our family's property in Muskoka by two officers from the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. Between those two moments, my grandfather and I dismantled everything they thought they had built. And the one weapon they never saw coming was the career they spent years mocking at every family dinner. Before I get into it, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Give this a like and subscribe if you have ever felt like the overlooked one in your family. You are not alone in that. I made the drive north on the Friday morning. Highway 400, then Highway 11, 2.5 hours out of the city into the granite and pine country of Muskoka. The leaves were at their peak. That particular October brilliance that only happens in Ontario, the maples burning orange and red against a sky so blue it almost looks painted. I had been looking forward to this weekend since August, my grandfather's 75th birthday. The family cottage on Lake Rosso, where we had gathered every Thanksgiving since before I was old enough to remember. I stopped at a Tim Hortons near Barrie and got 2 large double-doubles, because my grandfather always appreciated when I remembered how he liked his coffee. The cups sat in my center console the whole rest of the drive, going cold. When I turned off the highway onto the gravel road that winds down to the cottage, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No cars, no dock lights, no smell of wood smoke from someone who had started the fireplace early. I parked and sat with the engine running, trying to make sense of the stillness. The cottage was completely dark. I grabbed the coffees and my bag and went up the porch steps. The key still worked. Inside the air was cold and smelled like nothing. No food, no fire, no people. I stood in the doorway and called out. Nothing answered me. On the kitchen table, held down by the old moose-shaped paperweight my grandmother had loved, was a note in my mother's handwriting. Delia, your father and I took your brother to Whistler for the long weekend. He has been under enormous pressure running Grandpa's stores and needed a break. Since your caseload has been slow lately, we figured you could keep Grandpa company and make sure he gets his medication on time. There is food in the freezer. Do not let him near the dock without his life vest. Happy Thanksgiving. I read that note 3 times. Then I set both cups of coffee down very carefully, because my hands were shaking. It was my grandfather's 75th birthday weekend. The entire family had confirmed in a group chat that we were all coming. My brother had personally texted me 2 weeks before to ask what time I was arriving, and while I was navigating long weekend traffic with birthday coffees sitting in my car, they had packed their ski bags, booked flights out of Pearson, and left me a note like I was a house sitter they had found on Kijiji. I should explain something about my family before I go further. My brother is 3 years older than me. He never finished his business degree. Dropped out in second year to help my grandfather with the stores, which mostly meant showing up at locations with a new business card that said Director of Operations on it. My grandfather built that hardware chain from a single location in Sudbury into 14 stores across northern Ontario. My brother did not build any of it. He inherited a position. My father moved into managing the company's finances 2 years ago, after the family explained that my grandfather was showing early signs of cognitive decline and needed to step back from day-to-day decisions. Meanwhile, I put myself through law school on a mix of OSAP, student debt, and part-time work at a legal aid clinic. I articled at a small firm in Scarborough. I passed my Law Society licensing exams on the first attempt and built a practice in estate law, the kind of work that requires precision and discretion in equal measure because you are sitting with people at their most vulnerable. My family came to my call to the bar ceremony, and then spent the dinner afterward talking about how my brother had just negotiated a new supplier relationship for the stores. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, took a long breath and went to find my grandfather. He was in the sunroom at the back of the cottage, the one with the wide windows that look out over the dock and the lake. He was sitting in the rocking chair my grandmother had reupholstered 3 times before she passed, burgundy fabric gone soft and faded at the armrests. The room was cold. He had a blanket across his lap and he was sitting very still. I had been visiting him regularly since the family started talking about his decline. The confusion they described had worsened steadily over 8 months, they said. He sometimes did not recognize faces. He repeated the same question within minutes. My mother had described him at an Easter dinner to a table full of relatives as essentially fading. I had sat with him through those visits, holding his hand and talking quietly and not pushing him. It had broken something in me every time. I came around the side of the rocking chair slowly. I had a soft greeting ready. I touched his shoulder. He sat up. Not the slow, effortful movement of someone confused and cold. He sat up the way a man sits up when he has been waiting for something. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared. He turned and looked at me with eyes that were clear, completely, unmistakably clear. "Did your father take the truck?" he asked. I could not speak. I was looking at a man who, at our last visit 6 weeks ago, had called me by my mother's name twice and lost track of the conversation mid-sentence. Delia. His voice was steady, quiet, with that particular patience he had always carried, the patience of someone who knows exactly how to wait. "Did they leave?" "Yes," I managed. "They're gone, Whistler." He let out a long, slow breath that seemed to release something he had been holding for a very long time. "Good," he said. "Then we need to get started. Pull that daybed away from the wall, would you?" I stood there for 3 full seconds, then I moved the daybed. Tucked against the baseboard, wrapped in an old camping tarp, was a laptop. He asked me to set it on the coffee table and get it open. While I did, he stood up from the rocking chair. Not slowly, not carefully, but with the ease of a man who was 74 years old and had spent 50 of those years lifting and building things with his hands. He made us both tea in the kitchen while he talked. He spoke quietly and precisely, the way he always did when he was being serious about something. He had not been confused, he had been watching. It started 2 years ago, when he began noticing small things in the store accounts. Payments to suppliers he did not recognize, invoice amounts that did not match the purchase orders, margins shrinking in ways that no reasonable explanation could account for. He brought it up with my father. My father always had an answer. Rising fuel costs, a new vendor pricing structure, supply chain issues, he was handling it. My grandfather should rest. When my grandfather pressed harder, my father gently suggested that the stress might be affecting his clarity. He brought in a private physician, a doctor my grandfather had never met, who administered a cognitive assessment. The results, as relayed by my father, indicated early-stage decline. My grandfather was gently encouraged to step back from oversight. My father and brother would take over the day-to-day. My grandfather told me he knew, in that exact moment, what was happening. He had started his business with a bank loan and 17 years of 7-day weeks. He knew what his own mind felt like. It felt completely fine. But he also understood that if he fought them directly, they would manage the story. They would produce more assessments. They would have him declared incapable before he could do anything to stop them. So he let them believe they had already won. He maintained the confusion, repeated questions, got names wrong, stared at walls, and he watched. "Every time your brother called your work a waste," he said, setting a mug in front of me, "I wanted to say something. You spent years becoming exactly what this family needed, and none of them could see it. That is why I waited for you. I needed you here without them, with enough time to actually work." He opened the laptop and showed me the file. "I am an estate lawyer. I have reviewed more fraudulent power of attorney documents than most people know exist. I have sat across from families torn apart by exactly this kind of abuse. A trusted person granted legal authority over someone's life and assets, using that authority for themselves. I know what financial elder abuse looks like when it has been papered over carefully. What my father and brother had done was careful, but not careful enough. The first thing I found was the supplier, Northgate Supply Solutions, registered in Alberta, appearing on invoice after invoice as a vendor providing logistics and procurement consulting to the hardware chain. payments ranging from $9,000 to $43,000 a month over 22 months. I cross-referenced the business number against the federal CBSA registry. Northgate Supply Solutions had no import history, no employees on record with Service Canada, and a registered address that turned out to be a mailbox depot in Red Deer. A shell company. My brother had built it, and my father had authorized the payments. Over 22 months, they had transferred approximately $340,000 out of my grandfather's business operating account into an entity they personally controlled. Then I found the line of credit. They had applied for a $500,000 business line of credit against the hardware chain's assets. The application was signed by my grandfather, or rather, by someone who had traced his signature onto the document. I could see it immediately. My grandfather's signature has a particular rhythm, a slight rightward lean on the capital letters that is completely natural. The signature on the credit application was rigid. Someone had copied the shape but eliminated the motion. This is something estate lawyers learn to identify, because forged signatures in probate disputes cost families millions of dollars every year. I had seen dozens of them. I recognized this one within 30 seconds. I sat back and looked at my grandfather across the kitchen table. They drew $420,000 on the credit line, he said. I have the withdrawal history in the second folder. I was not able to trace where it went. I navigated to the withdrawal records. The money had moved through the shell company accounts and dispersed outward. My father's provincial property records showed a new purchase in Prince Edward County. My brother's records showed 2 vehicles registered in the last 18 months, and a ski condo in Whistler that explained, with some neatness, why they had chosen British Columbia for a birthday trip my grandfather had not been invited to attend. My phone rang. It was my brother. He did not say hello. The first thing I heard was the ambient noise of what I assumed was a lodge bar, and then his voice carrying the particular sharpness he reserved for me when he was irritated and in a hurry. I need you to do something. My visa got declined at the rental counter and it's embarrassing. Go into Grandpa's desk. There's a TD client card in the top drawer. The pin is the year he opened the first store. I think it's 1987. Transfer me $3,000 to my e-transfer. I'll sort it out when we're back. $3,000. From a man he had left alone at a cottage on his 75th birthday. No, I said. A pause. Delia. No, I'm not doing that. He doesn't even know what day it is, he won't notice. My grandfather was sitting across the table listening. He looked at the phone and then looked at me. He gave a single calm nod. He knows exactly what day it is, I said, and I'm not touching his accounts. My brother's voice went flat in the way it did when Charm stopped working. You've always resented that Dad trusted me with the business instead of you, so you went and became a paper pusher. Fine. But don't make this a whole thing. Just transfer the money. Don't be difficult. Enjoy the snow, I said, bundle up. I ended the call. My grandfather reached across the table and squeezed my hand once. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. I went back to the files. It was just before 9 o'clock when the monitoring alert came through on my phone. I had registered my grandfather's property address that afternoon with a real estate fraud monitoring service, something I do routinely when I suspect a property may be at risk of unauthorized transfer. The service flagged an active listing. The cottage. My grandfather's cottage on Lake Rousseau, the one he had built himself over 2 summers in 1985, where my grandmother had planted the rose garden along the south fence, where every birthday and Thanksgiving and Canada Day had happened since before I was born. Listed by a private brokerage in Bracebridge. Conditional offer accepted. Buyer, a numbered company registered in Quebec. Scheduled closing, 36 hours from now. My father had filed a power of attorney, purportedly signed by my grandfather 8 months ago, authorizing him to act on all real property matters. I pulled the document through the brokerage's disclosure package. I read the notarization certificate. The commissioner of oaths who had certified my grandfather's signature was a person whose authorization with the Law Society of Ontario had lapsed 4 months before the date printed on the document. A lapsed commissioner's certification is legally void. The signature it authenticated is unenforceable. This is not an obscure technicality. It is something every estate lawyer in Ontario is trained to check, and something most people outside the profession would never think to verify. My father had not accounted for me being the one to look at this. The power of attorney was void, the property sale was fraudulent, and it was going to close in 36 hours if I did not stop it. It was a Friday evening of a long weekend in October. Every courthouse in the province was closed until Tuesday. I called the Ontario Land Registry Emergency Fraud Line and reported the fraudulent authorization. I filed for an administrative flag on the property file through Terranet, Ontario's land registration system. The flag would not automatically stop the transfer, but it would create a formal record and complicate the closing enough to buy time. I called the RCMP's National Tip Line for Financial Crimes and filed a detailed report: the shell company, the forged credit application, the fraudulent property sale, the full paper trail I had been building for the past 3 hours. The officer who took my report asked twice if I was a licensed lawyer. When I confirmed I was and told him what I had, he said to stay available. Then I called the only Superior Court Justice whose clerk's contact I had in my phone. I had appeared before her twice in contested estate matters. I left a message that I understood was extremely inconvenient, explained the situation in under a minute, and gave my Law Society registration number. She called me back at 11:17. I presented the case in 10 minutes: fraudulent power of attorney, notarization by a lapsed commissioner, active property listing under that fraudulent authorization, closing in 36 hours, victim present, fully lucid, willing to provide sworn testimony by phone. Can he be available at 7 tomorrow morning, she asked. Yes, I said, absolutely. At 7:15 the next morning, my grandfather sat at the kitchen table in his housecoat with a cup of tea and spoke clearly and steadily into my phone for 12 minutes. He gave his full name, date of birth, legal address. He confirmed he had never signed the power of attorney in question, had never met the Commissioner of Oaths named on the document, and had never authorized the sale of the cottage or any other personal property. He stated that he had deliberately maintained the appearance of cognitive decline for 8 months in order to document financial misconduct by his son and grandson, and that he was entirely prepared to provide a sworn affidavit. At 9:50 Saturday morning, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice issued an emergency injunction blocking the land transfer. By 10:15, Terranet had flagged the title file. The sale was frozen. I sat down on the porch steps and looked at the lake for a long time without saying anything. My grandfather brought me a coffee and sat down beside me. You found the notary problem, he said. It wasn't a question. His authorization had lapsed 4 months before the document was dated, I said. If you're going to forge a power of attorney in Ontario, you should at least use a commissioner whose license is current. He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and genuine, the laugh I remembered from before any of this started. I had not heard it in almost a year. We spent the rest of the weekend working through what remained. I organized the full evidence file, prepared sworn statements, and coordinated with the RCMP investigator assigned to the fraud report. By Sunday evening, we had delivered a complete package: the Northgate Supply Solutions registry records, the forged credit application with the signature analysis, the fraudulent power of attorney, the attempted property transfer, and the financial trace from the business accounts to my father and brother's personal asset purchases. The investigator told me before she left that this was one of the cleaner cases she had received. When there's an estate lawyer doing the documentation, she said, it tends to come together. They arrived back on the Tuesday. My father's truck came up the gravel laneway in the late afternoon, when the light was going golden over the water. I could hear my mother before I could see anyone, her voice cutting through the still air, complaining about the Pearson to Sudbury connection and the state of the rental car they had driven up from the city. My brother was telling her the drive had been fine and to relax. My grandfather and I were sitting on the porch. They stopped at the base of the steps. My father looked at me. Then he looked at my grandfather. My grandfather looked back. He did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. The expression on my father's face, in the moment he registered that his father was sitting upright with clear eyes and his hands resting quietly in his lap, told me everything about what he had actually understood all along. My brother pushed past them toward the front door. He tried his key. New lock. I had installed a keypad unit on Saturday afternoon. He turned around with the expression of someone who has encountered an inconvenience they find personally offensive. What's wrong with the door? I changed the lock, I said. Why would you? Because access to this property is restricted to individuals whose names appear on the title. Your name does not appear on the title. My father took one step forward, lowering his voice into the measured, reasonable tone he used when he wanted to make you feel like the irrational one. Delia, let's all go inside and talk through whatever you think is happening here. We don't need to do this outside. The RCMP would actually disagree with you about the timing. My brother laughed, the short, reflexive sound he made when he wanted to signal that something was beneath him. You called the police? Over a lock, unbelievable. He was already reaching for his phone. Fine, I'll call them myself. This is completely out of hand and I'm not standing in the cold arguing with you. He dialed. I let him. He told the dispatcher that a family member had locked her elderly parents out of their own property and was behaving erratically, and that he was concerned for his grandfather's safety. He gave the address. He said it was urgent. It really is, I agreed quietly. They arrived 11 minutes later. 2 vehicles, 4 officers. One of them, a woman composed with the particular stillness of someone who has handled a great many situations more complicated than this one, looked at my father and brother and asked if they were the individuals named on the warrant. My brother said yes before he processed what the question meant. You're both being detained, she said, in connection with criminal fraud, misuse of power of attorney, and financial exploitation of an elderly person under the Criminal Code of Canada. Please come with us. My brother stared at her, then at me, then at my grandfather who was standing now, one hand resting on the porch railing, watching without expression. He has cognitive decline. He didn't understand anything he was told, whatever she told him. She manipulated him. You can't take this seriously based on what a confused old man. Sir, the officer's voice was not loud. It was the kind of quiet that stops people. Please come with us. My father walked to the police vehicle without a word. He did not look at my grandfather again. My brother did not go as quietly. He broke into a run somewhere between the porch steps and the laneway. The wet leaves along the edge of the lawn had gone slick with the evening damp, and he went down hard on his shoulder before he made it 10 meters. An officer helped him up by the elbow with no particular urgency. My grandfather made a small sound beside me. Not a laugh, not quite. Something quieter. I think it was the sound of 8 months of patience finally being set down. My mother was not arrested that evening. Her direct participation in the fraud was not provable to a criminal standard, and the initial RCMP assessment confirmed that. But I want to be clear that her situation was not simply resolved. She had filed joint tax returns with my father for many years. Some of those returns included deductions connected to Northgate Supply Solutions. The Canada Revenue Agency opened a formal audit of those filings within the month. The reassessments were significant. Several of her friends from the charitable board she sat on did not renew their association once the story appeared in the Sudbury Star. By spring, she was living in a much smaller house. She called me twice. I passed both voicemails to the RCMP investigator as part of the ongoing file. I did not return the calls. Accountability takes more than one shape, and hers was real, even if it was quieter than a courtroom. The hardware chain went through a formal restructuring process over the following months. The fraudulent line of credit was disputed with the lending institution, which cooperated once the fraud documentation was provided. A significant portion of the stolen funds was traced to identifiable assets, the Prince Edward County property, the vehicles, the Whistler condo. And those were seized through the court process. It was not everything. It is never everything, but it was enough to stabilize the company and service its legitimate debt obligations. My grandfather appointed me as his legal representative and the trustee of his personal estate. I spent the better part of 4 months restructuring the governance of the stores, independent financial review, dual authorization requirements on transfers above $10,000, a direct reporting relationship between the company's chartered accountant and my grandfather's legal file, vendor registration processes, an anonymous reporting channel for employees, the kinds of controls that should have been in place from the beginning, and that are in place now. My father received 11 years in federal prison. My brother received 8. The sentences were handed down at a courthouse in Sudbury in April, before a judge who noted in her remarks that the systematic exploitation of a family member for financial gain, conducted while actively managing that person's medical narrative to prevent them from seeking help, represented one of the more calculated cases of elder abuse she had encountered in her career on the bench. My grandfather attended the sentencing hearing. He wore the same dark sport coat he had worn to my call to the bar ceremony. He sat in the front row with his back straight and his face composed, and when the sentences were read aloud he nodded once. The small, decisive nod he always gave when he was satisfied that something had been handled correctly. On the drive home from the courthouse he asked me to stop at a Tim Hortons. He said he had been drinking herbal tea for 8 months because my mother kept serving it to him, and he had not wanted to break the performance by asking for anything else. I laughed so hard I had to pull off the road. That summer we opened the cottage on the Victoria Day long weekend, the way we always used to when I was small. The rose garden along the south fence had grown wild over 2 seasons of neglect, but the canes were healthy. My grandfather and I spent a Saturday afternoon cutting them back. He knew every plant my grandmother had put in, could name the varieties she had chosen, remembered the exact summer each one had been planted, and what she had said when she put it in the ground. His mind had always been fine, it had never been anything other than fine. He is 75 years old, and he built 14 hardware stores from nothing, and he sat in a rocking chair for 8 months pretending not to know what month it was, because he loved what he had built too much to allow it to be quietly dismantled. I think about that often, what it costs a person to make themselves small in order to protect something that matters. I also think about my brother's voice on the phone that Friday evening. Paper pusher, someone who didn't understand real business. Real business, as it turned out, required knowing that a commissioner of oaths has a license that can expire. It required reading a forged signature against an authentic sample and identifying in 30 seconds exactly where the copy had gone wrong. It required filing a Terranet flag on a Friday night of a long weekend, reaching a Superior Court justice before the markets opened Saturday morning, and documenting an entire chain of fraudulent transfers clearly enough that the RCMP investigator described the file as one of the cleanest she had ever received. I was never a paper pusher, I was always exactly what my family needed and refused to acknowledge. If you have ever been the one left behind to manage what everyone else didn't want to deal with, if you have ever had your abilities dismissed by the people who were secretly counting on you not to use them, I want to hear from you in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please hit like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one. What that October weekend in Muskoka taught me is simple, and I carry it with me now every day. The people who call your work a hobby are often the ones most afraid of what happens if you take it seriously. My grandfather knew what I was capable of when no one else in that family would admit it. And in the end, knowing that one person sees you clearly, truly sees you, is enough to change everything.